So welcome to a video lecture, the best type of lecture, on the original 13 British colonies. And now you're like, we already learned about British colonies. I'm like, yeah, Jamestown, which will turn in Virginia, and Plymouth, which will turn in Massachusetts. Sure, we talked about them, but there's more. There's 11 more. And so we're going to look at those other colonies today. But first, America. So if you look at this lovely flag, this is the American flag, you'll notice they are how many stripes? How many stripes, you may ask, are on this American flag? There are 13 stripes on the American flag. Why are they 13 stripes on the flag? Because, of course, there are 13 original British colonies, and they are still, loved by Americans today because, the flag and stuff. And so what we're going to do is we are going to look at the 3 colonial regions, one region at a time. So we'll start in New England, then we're going to go into the Chesapeake, also known as the Middle Colonies, and then we're going to look at the Southern Colonies. So when we go to each colonial region, first things first, we're going to say this is true of most of the colonies. So some generalizations about them all, and then we're going to break them down one at a time, tell you some things that are unique about each colony. And so we're going to start, of course, in the north. These are the northern colonies. So on your notes, you can see kind of like on the bottom, there's a little like paragraphy thing, a little blurb. So that's kind of some generalizations about this colonial region, but we're going to add some of our own notes. So maybe on like the New England colonies page next to that map, but kind of under the text, we're going to add some generalizations that aren't explicitly mentioned in the text that is provided for you. So some generalizations about New England colonies. One is Puritans. There are a bunch of Puritans in New England. And the Puritans in general didn't really tolerate any other religion. And so there's going to be very little religious toleration in New England because, the Puritans. Also, when we're talking kind of a little geography style, there's thin, rocky soil. But there is a lot of coastline and a lot of trees. So look at this lovely coastline. And so their industry is not going to be farming because the soil not good enough. What they're going to be doing is they're going to be ship builders, and they're also to some extent are going to be in the fishing industry, and also at some extent they're going to be in kind of like the shipping industry, as in like being ports and like trade and things like that. So not farming because of the bad soil, but fishing, shipbuilding, trading, lumber to some extent. So that is the economy in general. Of course, the climate, it's cold, long winters, not ideal at all for farming. And then this is just kind of a fun fact. I'm going to mention it now, although you won't be tested over this information until like a unit by Christmas time. But just as you can see here, you might be noticing something odd about this map. What's weird about the map, kids? What's weird about the map? Yeah, that's right. There are two Massachusettses, right? Massachusetts, right? So what happened is originally these were both controlled by Massachusetts, but right when we're getting to the part of history in America where we have tension between like the non-slave North and the full of slave South, we're going to be very much aware of keeping a balance between free states in the North and slave states in the South. So what's going to happen is in 1820, we're going to get the Missouri Compromise, in which case Missouri is going to enter as a slave state. And then Maine is going to enter the Union as a free state to keep that balance of slave and free states. So Massachusetts is going to like, bam, turn into Maine as a part of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. But like I said, the Missouri Compromise thing, you don't need to know it for your colonial American history test, but just be aware, it's coming. It's coming later. Okay, so enough of the general stuff. What we're going to start with is looking at these colonies individually. So first things first, we're going to look at New Hampshire. So New Hampshire is unique because it's squished in between Massachusetts and Massachusetts. In fact, it used to be a part of, you guessed it, Massachusetts. So this used to be one giant thing. Well, the King of England thought that perhaps Massachusetts had too much land, perhaps a little too much power, and so a way to literally break up Massachusetts's influence, he carved out a whole new little colony and gave it a charter and named it New Hampshire. So New Hampshire used to be a part of Massachusetts. Okay. All right, so who founded it? Over here, John Wheelwright founded it. Why did he found it? Well, we'll talk about this lovely lady down here in another lecture this unit. But Anne Hutchinson, just know for now that she is a heretic when it comes to the Puritans. And she was kind of like an uber Puritan. She was such an extreme Puritan. The Puritans were like, you're a little much too extra, Anne Hutchinson. And so just know he's considered to be kind of a heretic as well, because he was a disciple of this heretic Anne Hutchinson, more on her later. And so more or less, John Wheelwright is going to leave Massachusetts down here and head up to New Hampshire, up in New Hampshire. Okay, so that's kind of the story of New Hampshire. So let's look at this little GIF here, or GIF. So the idea is, this is how I remember John Wheelwright. So think of hamster, right? New Hampshire. And the little wheel is like wheelwright. And also you can see what this little hamster, this little brown hamster is doing. He's going up to a wheel, right? That's already taken. So this is like Massachusetts. And he's like, get away, Massachusetts. I want your land. And he's like, go away. Go away, Massachusetts. Damn, Massachusetts, no more. And John Wheelwright just took over Massachusetts. In this case, I guess Massachusetts is the wheel and the white hamster. This is a very meta sort of situation. But there's John Wheelwright going. Okay, so New Hampshire, done. 1 out of 13, good job. Let's move on. Massachusetts, again. So we've talked about Massachusetts when we talked about Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So this is going to be review, and I'm going to talk quickly. So here we go. So we have Plymouth, right? 1620, Pilgrims on the Mayflower, William Bradford's their leader, and they land at Plymouth Rock, right? And then they'll have the first Thanksgiving. We know that story. So that's Plymouth, 1620. 10 years later, 1630, we have a new crew headed to Massachusetts, and this is, of course, going to be our Puritans. Remember, Plymouth, these were our separatists. They wanted to separate completely from the Church of England. Puritans just wanted to reform or to purify the Church of England. And so John Winthrop is their man, and they don't land in Plymouth, but they land in Boston. Soon after the Puritans land in Boston, hashtag Massachusetts Bay, then we're going to see that great migration that we talked about before. We're going to see about 20,000 Puritans leave England and come to Massachusetts. And so after a while, these two are going to merge together in what we know and love today as Massachusetts. So map time, right? So here's Plymouth. That's the, William Bradford, that's the Pilgrims and the Mayflower. Up here 10 years later, this is going to be John Winthrop. This is going to be Boston. This is the Massachusetts Bay. After the Great Migration, what's going to happen is these two are just going to get chunked together into what we know, of course, today as Massachusetts. Other fun things, here's Cape Cod. You might have heard of that. Salem, hashtag Salem witch trials will be up here. Later on, we'll talk about that. And, just a good solid map. You're welcome. So that's review, Massachusetts, right? Those two will merge. Lovely. Okay, so for Rhode Island, before we talk about Rhode Island specifically, we're going to watch about a 1-minute clip from a Christmas classic. So just 1 minute. Here we go.
Hello there. Awesome.
Okay, so we're not watching the whole thing, but This is, of course, the island of misfit toys where all the broken or damaged toys end up. So, Rhode Island is the island of misfit Puritans. So all of those who don't quite fit in or are accepted in Puritan society, they're called heretics, more or less, are going to end up in Rhode Island, our island of misfit Puritans. So who found this island of misfit Puritans? Well, it is this guy right up here, Roger Williams. Roger starts with an R. Rhode Island starts with an R. So maybe that's a way you can remember it. But this is his situation. The Puritans don't like him so much. There's a couple of things. One, he's a separatist, so he's not really about reforming the Church of England, but he's more staunch, like, the Church of England's horrible. It must be ended. I don't want to be a member of the Church of England at all. So one, that's kind of one strike against him. He's a separatist and not really a Puritan. But the second thing kind of that's against him is that he's like, shouldn't we pay the Native Americans for their land? I mean, isn't this kind of like stealing their land? And the Puritans are like, shut up, Roger Williams, and we don't like you. And so besides the fact that he's a separatist and that he's making this issue out of, paying the Native Americans for land, he is exiled. He's kicked out of Massachusetts. And he literally has nowhere to go. And so he just goes down south and he ends up in, of course, Rhode Island. And so he founds Providence, Rhode Island. You may have heard of it before. So he's going to found Providence there. And there, he's going to allow all faiths to worship without interference there. So that's the nice thing about Rhode Island. All faiths are welcomed. And also kind of a fun fact here is when you're talking about the state of Rhode Island, the official constitutional name of Rhode Island is State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, because Roger William actually founded Providence Plantations first. And so the name kind of stuck there. So yeah, so Rhode Island, the island of misfit Puritans, thanks to our friend Roger Williams, who was exiled from Massachusetts Bay. Wonderful. Okay, moving on. We have Connecticut, land of the Gilmore Girls. So here's some things you ought to know about Connecticut. First things first is this lovely thing here that you think is stupid, but I'm going to make you remember because it's an important step in democracy, dang it. So the fundamental orders of Connecticut is actually kind of like the first constitution that we'll see in any of the colonies. So Connecticut kind of has the first state constitution, if you will. So that's something to know. Fundamental orders of Connecticut. Remember it for always and ever as the first constitution of the New World. Okay. Other things to know. So this is the situation with how it's founded. So Thomas Hooker, aren't you glad you don't have that name? So there's Thomas Hooker right here. So what's going to happen is he's actually going to start off, I'm going to show you a map here. He's going to start off actually in Cambridge, right? You know Cambridge, that's where Harvard is. So he's going to start in Massachusetts at Cambridge. But then he is going to defy the Massachusetts government, and he is going to lead his congregation. He's a preacher. He's going to lead his congregation outside of Massachusetts and into this new territory right here. And so he's going to establish Hartford as his new home. And of course, Hartford is going to be kind of the capital of Connecticut. So he's kind of this disgruntled preacher leaving Cambridge, leaving Massachusetts, and kind of breaking out on his own into Hartford. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind, something weird about Connecticut is New Haven. Yeah, I care that you know this. That's why I'm telling you. So New Haven's down here. And New Haven was kind of like super biblically based, very strict, even compared to Puritan terms. And so New Haven, which is a part of Connecticut today, actually kind of remained independent. from the other areas of Connecticut. So that's kind of one of the weird things. They're kind of like uber religious, and so they weren't under direct control of Connecticut, despite the fact like they were technically in Connecticut. All right, so stupid, boring map. Let's look at a fun map. This is a fun map. It has nothing to do with history, but I like it. So this is for those Gilmore Girls fans, which you may or may not be a member of. But regardless, there's some vital, or at least there's some geography here. So this is just for fun. This is a Gilmore Girls map. So here's Connecticut, here's Massachusetts. Of course, Rory, I can't say her name, the Gilmore Girls, Rory and Lorelai live in Stars Hollow, which is a fictional town. Their grandparents live up in Hartford, and that's also where Chilton is, Rory's school. And remember, Rory wanted to originally go to Yale down in New Haven, but decided, you know what, she really wants to go to Harvard, and so she ends up going to Harvard. So she's like the reverse Thomas Hooker, right? Thomas Hooker started in Cambridge and went down into Connecticut, and Rory was like, I'm in Connecticut, but I'm gonna go to Cambridge. You're welcome. So important. Use of your time. Okay, let's say goodbye to New England. Bye, New England. Bye, Puritans. Bye, rocky soil. We'll see you later. Let's move on to the breadbasket colonies, also known as, of course, the middle colonies. So once again, we're going to do some generalization when it comes to the middle colonies. So on your notes, kind of under the text that's typed out by the map, we're going to add some generalizations. One, I've mentioned, right? They're the breadbasket colonies, which means they're going to grow the food stuff. So how do you make bread? With flour. Where does flour come from? Wheat. So, right, they're going to grow they're going to grow crops like wheat, oats, corn, that sort of thing. So they're going to feed the colonies. Other things to keep in mind along with that is it's fertile soil, so good soil, mild climates, and a long growing season. All of these things help, grow them breadbasket crops. So fertile soil, mild climate, long growing seasons. Lovely. Also, we'll see that we're going to see a lot of indentured servants in this area. What's going to happen more or less is the Puritans are all going to be like, we don't want anyone if you're a Puritan, unless you're a Puritan. Down south, we're like, oh, we don't want to hire you because, we have slaves. And so a lot of indentured servants at this time are going to end up in the middle colonies here. Okay. Other things to mention is they're the most diverse. So they have the most immigrants coming in. They're the most welcoming of immigrants. Once again, they're the only place you can really go to get a job if you're not a Puritan or a slave. And then because of this diversity, they're going to be the most tolerant of different religions. Okay, so that's kind of some generalizations. Tolerant of religion, diverse, welcoming of immigrants, indentured servants, good climate, fertile soil, long growing seasons, and then the breadbasket, oats, wheat, corn, the like. So we're going to look at each of these colonies individually. Lovely. Okay, so we're looking at New York. We kind of mentioned New York before when we were talking about New Amsterdam because this used to be controlled by the Dutch. So this is the story of how the Dutch lost New Amsterdam. Okay, so this is the general idea. Like the Duke of York, he is British. He's the brother of the king. So it's kind of nice if your king's the brother because he gives you land. And so more or less what's going to happen is the king's going to give the Duke of York a bunch of warships, like a fleet of ships. And so the Duke of York brings in this fleet of ships to New Amsterdam and they're like, hey, give us your colony or else. And New Amsterdam's like, okay, we don't want to die. And so without the use of actual violence, but with the threat of violence, New Amsterdam, or I should say the Dutch, literally just hand over their colony to New York. All right, so with New York in general, what's going to happen is we're going to see that it's going to remain kind of a class of large landowners. What had happened, remember, with the Dutch is the Dutch had the patroon ships, where like each proprietor had a patroonship and they kind of ran it as their own little private fief, if you will. So those patroonships are going to kind of stick around with kind of new owners, but it's still going to have that kind of feel to it. So kind of a class of large landowners hanging out in New York. Okay, so I'm going to show you fun geography. So this is York in England, where the Duke of York was from. So when you're hearing New York, you could say, I guess, this is Old York. And so more or less, the New Amsterdam surrenders to the Duke of York, the king's brother, and he takes over. Okay, kind of along the same lines, we're going to look at New Jersey. So here's New York, here's New Jersey. Guess what? They used to be the same thing. So the Duke of York had all of this land, and so he decided that he was going to give a part of the land to two of his friends. And so he gives New Jersey to two of his friends. And so actually, originally, there was East Jersey and West Jersey, each controlled by a friend of the Duke of York. Eventually, over time, I guess you can see it's 1688, these two are going to merge into New Jersey. But just so you know, originally they were given as gifts to two of the friends of the Duke of York. And I'm not going to make you remember the names of the guys who controlled each part of New Jersey, but just kind of understand it was a gift from the Duke of York to two of his friends. Okay, moving on to, well, not yet Pennsylvania. I forgot this slide was here. So once again, we saw where Old York was, and this is where Old Jersey was. One of the guys who got Jersey as a gift of land was from this little island controlled by the British called Jersey. And so that's like the Old Jersey, if you will. Just kind of as an FYI. All right, on to Pennsylvania. Here we go. Okay, so Pennsylvania, I'm going to talk about it a lot because it is important, okay? So let's do it one step at a time. So here's who owns Pennsylvania. William Penn. Okay, so William Penn, this guy is where the Penn in Pennsylvania comes from. He's going to be the founder. So how does he get Pennsylvania? So Pennsylvania literally means Penn's woods. So like William Penn owned all of these woods. So Pennsylvania literally means Penn's woods. So the idea is the King of England owed William Penn's dad a lot of money. And so this is how he settled the debt. So the king owed a lot of money to William Penn's dad. And so to settle that debt, the king gave all of this land to William Penn. So like, yeah, sweet deal. William Penn wanted a colony for a lot of reasons, but mostly for religious freedom. So kind of like the Puritans and the Pilgrims didn't love the Church of England. Well, William Penn didn't love the Church of England either. He was a Quaker. So Quaker is a religion, and the Quakers are unique because in the Quaker faith, there is no clergy. There's not like a priest or a pastor or a reverend. What happens is the Quakers will meet together and they'll just sit silently until someone's inspired by God to stand up and talk. All right, so Quakers are really unique, and they're really, Pennsylvania was supposed to be kind of a safe haven for the Quakers. Other things to keep in mind with the Quakers, and I said, yeah, there's a lot. Quakers were very peace-loving people. They're really pacifists. They're really against war. They're also very just. So, for example, William Penn would buy land from Native Americans as opposed to just taking it over. So the Quakers, Pennsylvania, William Penn, those are all very much connected. And we'll be talking about this in future units as well. So might as well kind of learn about it now. Other things to know about Pennsylvania, and I said there is a lot. They're perhaps the best well-known of all of these colonies over in Europe because they advertised heavily to get new settlers to come on over. So when the Puritans are like, we don't like outsiders, Pennsylvania's like, come on to Pennsylvania, right? We want you to come to Pennsylvania. So they advertised heavily in Europe to get people to come over. What else do I want to know about this? Well, let's look at some pictures. So first thing, of course, we see the Quaker Oat guy. Guess who the Quaker Oat guy is? You got it, it's William Penn. That's fun. Do you want to hear a sad story? It's not a sad story, but this is definitely a side note. So Quaker Oats, you know, like the people that make Quaker Oats, they weren't Quakers actually. But because Quakers were known as being so honest and such a good business to deal with, they took the term Quaker Oats so people would trust them more because people trusted Quakers. And so whoever invented Quaker Oats, they weren't Quakers. They just said Quaker Oats because they felt people would trust them more. Okay, let's look at some pictures. So this is William Penn with a bunch of Native Americans. He's trying to buy their land because he doesn't want to take it over. And this is an advertisement, clearly not in English, but it is an advertising, you know, come to Pennsylvania and America, William Penn. And this is a bunch of stuff I can't read, but like I said, they advertised heavily in Pennsylvania. We're almost done with the Middle Colonies. Just one more. Delaware. Delaware, huh? There's, you know, more to Delaware than meets the eye. So let's kind of look at some things connected with Delaware. So you can notice here, Delaware actually used to be a part of Pennsylvania. It was the lower three counties of Pennsylvania for a long time. What made Delaware unique is the Swedes. So here are some Swedish fish, right? And so the Swedes had really kind of colonized, or really had, I shouldn't say colonized, but the Swedes had really kind of been in Delaware. They called it New Sweden. And so it's unique from Pennsylvania because it's not a bunch of Quakers, but it's a bunch of Swedes. And so even they were still, okay, the Delaware was still technically a part of Pennsylvania until the Revolutionary War, right? Delaware had their own representative assembly before then, but up until like literally the American Revolution, Delaware was technically still under the thumb of Pennsylvania. All right, what else do I want to say? So there's Swedes, the lower three counties of Pennsylvania. Also, might as well know this now, they are the first state of the United States. We'll mention this later, but they're the first colony to sign the Constitution, and so they became the first state. Fun fact. Another thing I'd like you to actually know, perhaps for the test, is the Mason-Dixon line. All right, so I hope you've heard of the Mason-Dixon line before. Maybe you've heard, oh, it's south of the Mason-Dixon line, meaning it's in the South, right? So this is what's going to separate New England from the South, or I should say the breadbasket colonies, the middle colonies from the South. So this is the situation. Pennsylvania is landlocked, and Pennsylvania's like doesn't want to be landlocked. Pennsylvania wants to get access to the ocean. And so for the longest time, Maryland, so like actually it's 100 years, Maryland and Pennsylvania are fighting because Pennsylvania so badly wants to get a little access here to the ocean. And so after 100 years of fighting, they finally create something called the Mason-Dixon line that establishes the modern day border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, okay? And so today you'll hear, you know, if it's in the South, how do you know it's in the South? Well, it's south of the Mason-Dixon line, the line that separates Pennsylvania from Maryland. Isn't that exciting? So exciting. Hey, let's look at a map. Oh, there's Sweden, in case you didn't know where old Sweden was. There you go. Also, this is a fun meme. Sweet tea? Heck yes, because I'm from south of the Mason-Dixon line, sir. That cadence was off, but south of the Mason-Dixon line. All right, we are done with the middle colonies. On to our last set of colonies, and that is the southern colonies. So let's talk about generalizations. We're going to write those down on the bottom. One, it's all about cash crops. Crops that you grow to strictly sell. So you're not really eating this stuff necessarily. So cash crops in the South, cash crops included tobacco. We knew that. Hashtag Jamestown. Cotton, rice, indigo. But at this time, really, it's tobacco and rice are the two biggest ones. Cotton's going to become more popular after the invention of the cotton gin, but that's not until right before the Civil War. So really, it's rice and rice and tobacco that are the main cash crops. What's the climate like in the South? Well, you already kind of know. So mild winters, warm climates, good soil for crops. The South is all about slaves for the most part. And religion really isn't as impactful as it would be like in New England because people are spread out so far. It's hard for them to actually even maybe attend services. And so it's present, but not perhaps as impactful as in other colonial regions. So let's talk about Maryland. Okay, so this is the situation in Maryland. Maryland is given to a family. So before we had like joint stock companies getting a charter to create a new colony by the king, but now we're having people called proprietors. And proprietors literally like owned the colony. It's not a joint stock company, but in Maryland, it's a family. So the Calvert family more or less is in control of, can kind of run Maryland as they see fit. And so the head of the Calvert family is Lord Baltimore. Hashtag Baltimore, Maryland. Okay, so it's a proprietorship. It was gifted to the Calvert family. And why does the Calvert family want a colony? Well, once again, religious freedom. So like our Pilgrims in Massachusetts, our Quakers in Pennsylvania, we have our Catholics in Maryland. And so think of like Mary, like the mother of God. So think of Maryland, you can kind of remember it's the Catholic one. It's actually named after a queen, but anyway, that's how I remember it. Maryland, Mary, sounds Catholic. Something unique about Maryland is they have the Act of Religious Toleration, which gives religious toleration for all Christians, so Catholics and Protestants, but it did not extend religious toleration to Jews or to atheists or anybody else. So it's pretty good, but not exactly total religious freedom. All right, other things to know about Maryland. It does start as a safe haven for Catholics, but over time there's going to be a lot of Protestants who are going to help settle it. And it's once we get an influx of Protestants in, that's where we get the Act of Religious Toleration from. So that's just like a little bit about Maryland. Other than that, it's going to be really similar to Virginia. It's going to be, tobacco. It's going to be slaves. That's kind of their economy. Okay, speaking of Virginia, we're going to watch just one little bit of this clip. So if you've ever seen Hairspray, I'm sure you have. Hairspray is based in Baltimore, Maryland, and the opening scene, she sings about how much she loves Baltimore. So I'm just gonna it's gonna be 30 seconds, but it's gonna be fun, right? Because you love how much time this video is taking you to watch. So be really quick. I'm going to... Wasn't that fun? That was so fun. Okay, moving on. Virginia is a review, so we're going to review this quick. Virginia, Jamestown, John Smith. the guy who marries Pocahontas and brings tobacco to its ailing economy, John Rolfe. Okay, enough said. Enough said. All right, moving on. So now we're going to talk about North and South Carolina. So write this stuff maybe under North Carolina for right now. But just FYI, the Carolinas used to be kind of one giant colony. It was called the Carolinas. And what happened is the king, and this is going to be history that you don't need to know, but kind of need to understand. So Oliver Cromwell had like taken over England. He took power away from the king. But the king's like, I don't like this. And so the king like fought his way back for control of England. And so when the king got back on the throne, when he was restored to the throne, he rewarded those who helped him get back on the throne. And so what he did is he gave a bunch of land to his buddies, those who had supported him in his fight to take back England. All right, so there are 8 proprietors. So once again, not a joint stock company, but just literally a gift of land. 8 proprietors were given the Carolinas as their own personal kind of colony. So once these 8 proprietors got a ton of land for themselves, then they opened it up to it's kind of like a head right system that we talked about was in Virginia. So if you bring over, 100 settlers, you get this amount of land. So just kind of realize they do stake a lot of land for themselves, but then a head right system's imposed to kind of give away the rest of the land. So just kind of realize this. Okay. Also kind of in general, North and South Carolina, even when it was one colony, had a different kind of feel to each region. North Carolina is going to be small farms. South Carolina is going to be large plantations. And so eventually these two are going to split in two. So let's talk about each one here. So North Carolina, I'm going to kind of just review here. It was, I don't know how to say it, like the riffraff of Virginia. So all the people who didn't like Virginia, who were discontented, who were resistant to authority, decided to move on south to North Carolina. So kind of these more backwoods farmers sort of people. So, whatever, I do what I want sort of people. The riffraff from Virginia were North Carolina. So they tended to be poor and they tended to have small farms. Okay. All right, in the South, then, we have South Carolina. And South Carolina, this is a little clip here from Gone with the Wind, but South Carolina is like the traditional South with the big plantations and the white houses. They tended to be people that had money. And South Carolina's economy was also very much based on like the sugar islands in the West Indies. Because what was happening is South Carolina was kind of growing the food that fed the slaves in these different islands, specifically Barbados. South Carolina had heavy trade with Barbados. And so they grew specifically rice, and that rice would then be fed to the slaves in the Barbados. And so that was really South Carolina's deal. Something else to note, rice itself was originated in West Africa. And so it was a crop of choice for a number of reasons, but mostly because the Africans knew how to grow it because they had grown it in West Africa. And so it was a kind of a cash crop in that regard. It really went to feeding the slaves in these little sugar islands down there. So like I said, eventually these things are going to divide in two. In case you're curious about the year, in 1719, they divide in two, right? North Carolina, more, riffraff. South Carolina, more, aristocratic people with large plantations. Last but not least, we have Georgia. Now, Georgia's fun, okay? Because down here south of Georgia is Florida. Florida's controlled by Spain, and so Georgia is a buffer colony that protects South Carolina from Spanish-controlled Florida. The guy in charge of Georgia is General James, let me try to say this right, Oglethorpe, that guy. And he is indeed a general. Like I said, Georgia has to protect themselves against invasions of the Spanish in Florida. And so they actually nicknamed James our perpetual dictator because he was very heavy-handed when it came to Georgia, and he needed to be. So not only is he a buffer against Spanish Florida, but a lot of impoverished English ended up in Georgia. A lot of people who were in debtor's prison in England were sent down to live in Georgia. And so there is a lot of prisoners that were in Georgia that were just kind of dropped off from England. Some other things, no Catholics were allowed in Georgia because they feared you might, collude with the Spanish because the Spanish were Catholics. So no Catholics allowed. They had very limited trade with the natives because they didn't trust them. And also, no Africans were allowed, free or slave, simply because they wanted to keep like a tight rein on the Georgia colony. All right, so we have looked at all three colonial regions and we talked about generalizations. And then, of course, we looked at all of the colonies as an individual. In case you're wondering about the dog, I thought it looked like the dog was in prison. So he's in Britain, but then he goes and he's free in Georgia. Debtor's prison. Freedom in Georgia. Debtor's prison. Freedom in Georgia. Anyway, I hope this went well. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me later in class. All right. Fantastic. Goodbye.